Okay, great to have everybody here. Um, there are a few seats up close. If anybody wants to come back, you can be closer. We're very happy to have you here today. This is a very timely gathering. There's a lot going on, and as you know, tomorrow afternoon there will be a meeting of U.S. and Mexican officials to try to explore ways forward in handling these migration issues, and I'm sure on their minds will be trying to avoid the imposition of U.S. tariffs on Mexico, which, as we'll explore and talk about, would have very serious impacts. We're very fortunate to have with us today my former colleague and former Ambassador of Mexico to the United States, Ambassador Arturo Saracon. Also, Rachel Schmetke is with the Wilson Center and has been working on these migration issues from here at the Mexico Institute. Carlos Heredia, we're fortunate to have with us today. He's a very distinguished professor, researcher, writer, and worker on many of these issues, including he has been thinking a lot about Central America over recent months in particular, because this isn't a problem that just surprised people. It's been developing for a while. And then Eric Olson from the Wilson Center, but also working with the director of the Central America DC platform of the Seattle International Foundation, but has also a long history of looking at Central American challenges and also the security challenges across this part of the world. So I'm going to start off and just ask Rachel to say a little bit about the current situation, what we've been facing, what Mexico has been doing, what the United States has been doing to handle these flows.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for coming to the event. It's been an interesting week, to say the least, in U.S.-Mexico relations. I'm going to talk a little bit about, as Ambassador Wayne said, sort of an overview of the situation in terms of what Mexico is doing, how that's been happening with the United States. So there's been the claim from the Trump administration that Mexico is, quote unquote, not doing enough, right? And that is in some ways false. And so the first sort of demand that the United States has been giving to Mexico has been to sort of tighten border security, right, to up enforcement. And now Mexico has had, in some ways, difficulties in enforcing the Mexico-Guatemala border, in part because there are 300 informal crossings at the Mexico-Guatemala border. There was some staffing issues with the National Migration Institute of Mexico. There have been some firings due to corruptions and things of that nature. And so there has been challenges for sure on the enforcement front. However, in April, we saw that in Mexico had already deported 14,900 migrants. In May, there was 15,600 Central Americans and other migrants deported from Mexico. So enforcement has been increasing in recent months. So the claim that, again, that Mexico is not doing enough on enforcement is not necessarily true. The enforcement has been increasing since January, and it is likely to continue to increase in the coming months. The second demand that the United States has made for Mexico is to crack down on smuggling units. Now, there's been 400 arrests since December related to human smuggling, but there are also difficulties regarding this issue, particularly around information sharing between the United States and Mexico, which presents a challenge to determine who is a human smuggler, what the threats are. And another issue I think that we could talk about a little bit is the policies that are being enacted on the U.S.-Mexico border and the stop-and-start nature of a lot of the policies. Many migrants are feeling currently that they have to sort of get to the U.S. border and get in now because there would be issues in the future where the border will either be closed or there'll be extra barriers. And so that also increases the demand for smuggling units to operate and charge more prices. So that's another big issue. And then the third demand that I'll talk about just quickly is an arrangement by which asylum seekers would be required to apply for asylum in Mexico. And now that some people have heard of this as a third country agreement, and Mexico stated that they will not do that. But I will say that there's projected to be about 60,000 asylum claims this year alone in Mexico. And so Mexico is becoming increasingly more a country of destination where there are asylum seekers who are wanting to apply for asylum and stay. But there are huge challenges. The COMAR, which is the Commission for Refugee Assistance in Mexico, is very much understaffed. And the ability to absorb this many is just not currently in the works for Mexico. And so there would need to be an increase in resources given to the Comar to absorb asylum seekers. So those are sort of the main challenges right now. Where things go this week remains to be seen, but that's sort of a general overview of the numbers that we have.
Thank you, Rachel, very much. So I think it's probably fair to say that both countries are overwhelmed in this moment
Absolutely.
in their capacity to manage the number of people headed northward.
Yes, this is an unprecedented number of flows, and both institutions on both sides are
So-
struggling to keep up.
So Carlos, looking at it from Mexico's perspective and trying to figure out what's happening, why it's happening, how to manage it, what's it look like?
Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. Good afternoon, everybody. The question I want to start with is, how did we get to a situation in which the United States government threatens to unilaterally impose tariffs on Mexico with which it has a trade agreement, a free trade agreement? How is it possible that the President of the United States is intent on building further segments of a border wall that separates it from its trade partner, de facto expelling Mexico from North America? The point of the USMCA is to eliminate tariffs on goods flowing between the United States and its North American trading partners, not to raise them. Trump's potential Mexico tariffs run directly contrary to these commitments. This is exactly what unilateralism looks like. But we're not here to focus on Trump's personality. We're here to discuss an unprecedented attack on the country that for several months has become the United States' largest trading partner. Mexico is an integral part of the U.S. economy. Over the past couple of days, when I tell even U.S. government officials that that Mexico's trade with the United States is larger than the trade that the UK, Germany, Italy, and France combined do with the United States, they're taken aback. They say, I didn't know that. And I guess we need to do better work in communicating that precisely because of the de facto integration of our shared production capacity. Now, the imposition of tariffs will not reduce the migration flows. Oscar Martinez, who's a very clever journalist from El Salvador, describes the current situation in Central America, stating that they no longer conjugate the verb to migrate. They now use the verbs to flee. I flee, you escape, we leave. Because of the unbearable situation in Guatemala, in ample zones of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Meanwhile, President Trump says that the U.S. is full. But in reality, at the ground level, much of the U.S. economy has the opposite problem. an aging population and a declining birth rate among the native-born population means a shrinking workforce in many areas. And I have to add to this, and it will surprise probably many in the audience, that in northern Mexico there's also a shortage of workers. As for Mexican and Central American migrant flows, as long as we do not address the root causes of migration, things are bound to remain the same. Containing, detaining, and deporting migrants will not do the trick. The United States has to seriously consider whether it will end the temporary protected status, the TPS, that Salvadorans and Hondurans have as a means to stay in this country, because massive deportation of these nationals will increase the difficulties and the lack of tranquility, if there is any left in Central America. So failure to pass a permanent solution through legislation would put Salvadoran and Honduran TPS beneficiaries at risk of return to their home countries, as well as having profound negative impact and undermine the stated U.S. goals of improving security, prosperity, and governance in the region. As long as we do not work with Central American societies to tackle the root causes of migration, namely poverty, systemic violence, natural resource predation, and political fraud, everything else means tiptoeing around the core of these issues. Now, after migration, President Trump gave Mexico an ultimatum while blaming us for U.S. drug problems. This tactic is decades old, and it has always involved a lot of hypocrisy. We're going to give them a one-year warning, and if the drugs don't stop or largely stop, we're going to put tariffs, he told reporters. And if that doesn't stop the drugs, we close the border. As one expert put it, while drugs do flow through Mexico, they also flow through the United States, feeding the biggest drug market on the planet. If the United States government fails to halt the river of narcotics inside its own territory, how can it expect Mexico to succeed? Our countries are so integrated that every single issue we bring to the table is interdomestic. That is, simultaneously domestic and international. That is the case for migration, security cooperation, drug policy, transborder issues, the environment, and climate change. Finally, I would like to say that opposite to what an increasing number of Mexicans are thinking, that we should reduce trade with the United States and go approach China, I believe that we need to extend and expound our links in a cross-section of links with the U.S. society. We have to expand our links with the border states, with cities, with mayors and governors that do want to work with Mexico, and with the American people. We need to engage more in citizen diplomacy, in knowing each other, and not only be led by what stems out of the Oval Office. The real issue, is whether in both of our countries we can build an economy that serves the majority of the population and not just a few people. The United States is the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, and according to Trump, the economy here is booming, and yet most Americans have little or no savings and live paycheck to paycheck. I expect that one day we will be working together on making access to clean water, quality education, and affordable health care a reality for Central American and Mexican people. That would be a much smarter and wiser approach than bullying thy neighbor. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Carlos. Eric, from the perspective of someone who's been working on Central America for a while now, What can you tell us about the current situation and the kind of steps that can lead to progress?
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. Thank you, fellow panelists. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about this very timely issue. Yeah, I think, let me just make a few points in reference to your particular question. I think in general, the assumption has always been, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong, that the drivers of migration, as Carlos has alluded to, has been, severe violence, lack of economic opportunity, and corruption in government that has made government less effective in what it does. I think sometimes we link those things too closely to migration, and so, we can say, if homicides go up 5%, migration will go up 5%, and if homicides go down 5%, migration will go down 5%. What we see right now in Central America is exactly the opposite, right? Homicides are down in Honduras by as much as 40%, and yet we see big numbers of Hondurans coming. Homicides in Salvador are down, and yet, we see Salvadorans coming, Guatemalans as well. So I think that these are drivers of migration underneath, but I don't think we should link them sort of at a one-to-one ratio. There's some difference there. And I would actually argue a second point here, that it's not so much the specific numbers of homicides or the specific underemployment or poverty. It's a general sense of despair and lack of hope in the future. People don't see their hope in some of these areas of Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala. And the new president of Nicaragua has said, where did that come from? The new president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, has said this numerous times. I don't know how many of you are Salvadorans, but he has said this. People are fleeing El Salvador in his mind because of despair and lack of hope. And I think that's true. Yes, homicides, economic opportunity, but there's an underlying, feeling that we don't see any destiny here in our countries. And in my mind, that has a lot to do with the erosion of the credibility of the state to be able to provide safety, security, jobs, decent education, health care. I think there's just a general lack of hopefulness in the governance of Central America. Now, that may be changing a little bit in El Salvador, where people voted massively for Nayib Bukele, believing that he was going to bring a new era. Let's hope that happens. It was a little bit similar to what happened in Mexico, where people, traditionally voting for other parties suddenly go to AMLO, feeling that he was going to bring about a new era in Mexico. I think there's that hope in Salvador. I hope it's successful. But overall, I would say there's a general lack of hopefulness and general despair in Central America. Now, while the countries of Central America and the governments of Central America are, basically responsible for this, I'm not trying to take anything away from them. There's also a sense in which this crisis around migration can't be seen as just the problem of an individual country. This has now become, in my mind, a regional issue, and we should see this not just as what is Honduras doing, what is Salvador doing, what is Mexico doing, as the president is saying now. We need to see this as a regional challenge, and that the framework for viewing that challenge regionally is a framework of shared responsibility. I know that's not very innovative on my part, but really what we need to break through here is this notion of pointing fingers at one another, right? We need to talk together, and each country take some responsibility. I believe strongly Mexico could do more. I'm not saying they're not doing anything, but they could do more. So could the United States, quite frankly. We could have more people at the border hearing cases related to asylum to get rid of the backlog. That would be an important step forward. Same with Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. They could be more active and more involved in finding solutions in this regional context. My final point is that if we understand this in a regional context, then it opens up an opportunity for both Mexico and the United States to come together around some kind of a development plan for Central America. I don't believe, and this is what I want to be careful of, I don't believe that it needs to be a Marshall Plan of $20, $30 billion. In fact, I think quite the opposite, and I defer here to my good friend Carlos, who has talked about this as well. Central America has been sold these mega projects, mega proyectos, dams. There was the Plan Puebla Panama that was going to integrate Central America and all this hyper infrastructure stuff. None of it individually, I think, is a problem, but it builds up expectations. It creates conflicts in society. Indigenous people, native people, campesinos, environmentalists feel threatened when there's this mega project being pushed down their throat that's going to supposedly solve all their problems. So I would say this is an opportunity for all the countries and civil society to get together and talk about specific achievable development goals in these countries. And I think, you don't have to solve it all at once. If you can actually make good progress around specific things, Carlos alluded to healthcare, education, potable water you've mentioned. I mean, I think this approach that involves civil society, that's not the typical top-down Marshall Plan, we're gonna buy our way out of this thing. I think there's more opportunities. Sadly, and I finish with this, sadly, we're at a moment when the U.S. government is withdrawing from these kinds of programs, these kinds of assistance programs in Central America, something that I feel very unfortunate. Not every program that U.S. funds is perfect, let's be honest, but there are a number of things that are being done in Central America that are showing real results. They may not make the headlines of our daily newspapers or Fox News, but they're showing response, and those are the kinds of things that we need to be investing in to reestablish a sense of hope, of future in Central America, because otherwise we're going to be stuck with building walls and detaining more people, and it's just going to be a never-ending crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, very much. Okay, Arturo, you've spent well over a decade working on the importance of U.S.-Mexico relations, helping build that importance, helping build this partnership. We're now at a point where, in fact, it is the headlines that are driving things, not the longer-term thinking. What do you see both evident in the short term of the dangers that are in front of us if this goes wrong, and how can we start to move it to what goes right in dealing with what everybody admits are really complex, difficult issues that need both short-term and long-term measures to address them?
Thank you, Tony, and it's a pleasure to be here with my good colleagues and friends. It's been more than a decade. It's actually been almost 20 years trying to push this boulder up the hill.
I just left the S off. Decades.
Look, I think at the crux of the problem is that we have a fundamental political and paradigmatic disconnect between two governments, between two presidents. I think the governments, both U.S. officials and Mexican officials, have been doing yeoman's work to prevent the wheels from falling off the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But there is a fundamental disconnect going on here because you've got two presidents who've got very peculiar views about foreign policy and the role that their respective countries need to play on the international arena. In many ways, they're both sort of different manifestations of isolationists. Donald Trump, in many of the sort of traditional isolationist positions that this country has seen over the course of its history. López Obrador, as someone who isn't unique. I like to remind people that his position that the best foreign policy is domestic policy is something that you see prevalent amongst many left-of-center politicians who come into power. President Obama said this openly during his campaign in 2008, that the best way to solve some of the challenges that the United States was facing at the time was to, put the house in order and improve education and infrastructure and the economic circumstances of so many Americans. So he's not unique in that sense. But the problem you do have is you've got two presidents who really, particularly in the case of Mexico's president, aren't spending too much bandwidth on foreign policy, don't understand each other, and don't understand each other as nations. In many ways, if you want to think of it this way, you've got one president who does foreign policy in 240 characters, and you've got another president who does foreign policy in 7,050 characters. But there's a bit of a lost in translation process in which both of them, by the way, are talking to their domestic constituencies more than to one another. Right. So there's a bit of the problem of how do you ensure that the machinery of day-to-day engagement between bureaucracies in Mexico City and bureaucracies in Washington, D.C. continue to work. One of the unique features of this relationship over the past 20 plus years is that the relationship has become truly institutionalized. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any country in Washington, D.C. that has such a complex and broad agenda with every single agency in the U.S. government. No country matches what Mexico and the United States have in terms of the depth and the breadth of engagement on everything from veteran affairs to, and some of you are going to say, well, my first activity as ambassador when I arrived in 2007 was to go to Walter Russell Meade to visit Mexican veterans who'd come back from Iraq and Afghanistan who had enrolled in the U.S. Armed Forces as a means of obtaining their citizenship. And so even there, Mexico has a very profound and very important agenda. So you've got that complexity, but then at the same time, you've got two presidents who aren't quite in sync as to what they expect of one another and how they see the relationship moving forward. So that's a bit of a challenge. But the greatest problem right now, obviously, is a mismatch between reality and perceptions. The gravest, I think, danger right now is you have President Trump, who has done something that we spent 20 plus years seeking to avoid, which is the linkage of disparate issues in the bilateral agenda. We very quickly understood in the Mexico-U.S. relationship that because of this complexity, if you had a problem, say, in exports of Mexican tomatoes to the United States, you would solve this within the confines of the trade agenda. You wouldn't bring in other issues, non-related issues, to leverage the solution of that agenda. So if we had a dispute on trade, we would solve it within the confines of trade. When in 2009, the U.S. was not complying with its NAFTA obligations to allow Mexican trucks to access U.S. soil, what we did was put in a carousel of countervailing duties to force the Teamsters and their allies on Capitol Hill to back down. We didn't put in what we're doing on security or intelligence sharing or migration. We solved it in the immigration track. What the president has now done by linking migration to tariffs is a reversal of one of the most important tenets of U.S.-Mexican relations over the past 20 years. More importantly, he's done it on one issue, which is and should be, and he says is one of his priorities, which is getting USMCA ratified in the U.S. Congress, in the Canadian Parliament, and in the Mexican Senate. The fact, obviously, that he did this, that he announced the threat of the tariffs 4 hours after the Mexican government had submitted the USMCA text to the Mexican Senate for ratification even made this more galling. But the problem here now is, okay, we've got two issues at play: trade and immigration. We can work on the immigration conversation, which is definitely a salient issue in which Mexico needs to do its part to ensure that our border with Guatemala is much more secure than it is today. Because as most things in this relationship, you need two to tango. And that paradigm of joint responsibility that we were able to finally get the Bush administration and later the Obama administration to turn into sort of the paradigm of how we engage on these issues, it works both ways. And Mexico also has to be co-responsible in working to ensure that we have a much better control of our border with Guatemala and Belize. Belize is not the problem really, but Guatemala and Belize. And that we're working hand in hand with the United States to ensure that our border in a post-9/11 world is not used to undermine the national security of the United States. But you're not going to solve it by bringing into the mix the issue of trade at a very, very complex moment when the roadmap to USMCA was already bumpy because of political calculations and/or miscalculations as we head to the presidential polls here in 2020, and because of what's at stake in Canada with their parliamentary elections in October. So the first issue I think that we have in front of us, Tony, is how do we decouple, how do we de-link an issue which the president has artificially put together, which is trade, apples and pears, trade and immigration. I would suggest that Mexico should very unequivocally say that if the tariffs are put in place on June 10th, Mexico will reinstate the carousel of countervailing duties on a host of U.S. products, from bourbon to potatoes to Harley-Davidsons, because it has proven to be a very effective mechanism to push back, especially because of the asymmetry of power between Mexico and the United States. It worked in 2009. It worked last year when President Trump slapped the tariffs on steel and aluminum on Canada and Mexico based on national security considerations, which is, again, galling to two countries that work hand in hand with the United States on security issues. So the first issue, I think, is Mexico has to unequivocally signal that if this does happen on June 10th, it will respond with countervailing duties. To continue to sort of try and separate the conversation on migration, what we can continue to do together. I think Mexico needs to emphatically underscore what it has already been doing in terms of helping the United States with Central American transmigration through Mexico. Mexico, just in the 6 months of 2019, at a high, I must say, political and diplomatic and perception cost, has deported 75,000 Central American migrants back to their countries in Central America. And we currently have approximately 18,000 Central American claimants of asylum status in the U.S., who have been sent across the border by the U.S., who are in Mexico right now on the Mexican side of the border at a huge financial and social cost for municipalities and states in Mexico, 18,000. So the challenge here also is, as you've all seen, the president said, I will determine if Mexico is doing a good enough job or not. We don't have a benchmark. What's the benchmark of Mexico improving, succeeding? Obviously, I was asked today by Fox Business News, what can you do between now and June the 10th? This is not, if we haven't been able to solve it in a year and a half when we really started seeing these important spikes of Central American migration, you're kidding me. This is not going to happen in 7 days. You can't enforce your way out of a migration crisis. It's not going to happen. That's not the way you're going to solve it. So I think the big challenge that we have in the coming hours and days, apparently the first meeting is going to take place tomorrow, is I think Mexico should try and separate and segment the conversation. We're going to talk about what we can do on immigration. We have nothing to discuss on tariffs and trade because that is not the issue. That is not the problem. But if you do apply these tariffs on June 10th, then Mexico will respond in kind with the countervailing duties.
Thank you, Arturo. And in fact, so what you're pointing out here is there are also two sets of costs of mishandling this. On the tariff side, neither economy really needs a tariff battle. And this is going
Absolutely not.
it is going to, as many people have said, end up being a tax on consumers and producers in both countries. And when the retaliation comes in, as you indicated, it's going to include a lot of agricultural goods. And so that's going to hit American farmers who are already shaking after what's happening with what's been happening for a while with Canada and Mexico on the steel tariffs, and now what's still going on with China. So this is a moment when there are a lot of people feeling the uncertainty, the unpredictability of what we've experienced in recent months, and very worried about what will come. And then on the immigration side, as you said, there are no miracle cures here. I mean, nobody really fully understands why all these people decided now is the moment to come. We know, as Eric was saying, there are underlying causes, but they're still coming out in large numbers despite enforcement. And even if enforcement gets bigger, it's not going to get better and bigger fast enough to keep up with the numbers right now. It's going to take time.
Certainly not before the 25% tariffs kick in
Right.
in October. So that's a problem.
And so there are a lot of costs on enforcement also. And as was noted, I think Carlos noted it, the United States hasn't been able to agree to send more asylum adjudicators to the border, even though we've known for a long time that you need more asylum adjudicators to get over this long backlog, plus the many people arriving now. So there are big costs on each side. Maybe what we'll do is just open up to questions now, because I know there'll be a lot of lively questions here. And please identify yourself and say what your affiliation is. And let's go back here to this hand with the blue sleeve connected to it.
Thank you. My name is Deborah Saunders. I'm with the Las Vegas Review-Journal.
And there'll be a microphone.
Senator Schumer just said, frankly, I don't believe that President Trump will actually go through with the tariffs. When he doesn't, we should be ready to proceed to these common sense policies instead. So my question is this: is the most likely outcome that Mexico will seriously change its policies to accommodate President Trump, that both sides agree to face-saving measures that don't really change anything, or that the tariffs begin? Thank you.
Who'd like to take that one on? Maybe Arturo, you want to start?
I hope Senator Schumer's right. If you saw the remarks from President Trump in London, if I can read English as I think I can, it's basically a message of tariffs are on June 10th. I think he wants to have an ongoing negotiation with Mexico with the 5% tariffs already on as a means to pressure the Mexican government. So I think I would probably say that I think the scenario of June 10th coming along and us not having found a way which both countries can claim we have avoided a crisis, I think is pretty high. What happens between June 10th and the next timeline, which I think is July 1st for the next ratcheting up from 5 to 10, that will be the crunch time. And that's where we'll see if there's anything that can be done, if the Mexican government can repackage some of what it's done so as to create a narrative of Mexico is doing stuff and we can continue to do more stuff. But I think at the end of the day, the big problem in which President Trump has put the Mexico-U.S. relationship is, if you're Mexico, are you going to accept policymaking by tirade and ultimatums? And I guess that's a very tough question to answer.
Carlos, you want to add?
Yes. Well, if there is any logic to the way that President Trump handles policy, is that he likes conflict. He likes to create problems and then pressure the opponent and humiliate the opponent and keep the threat lingering. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I think I see what Arturo described as a most likely scenario, but there's another scenario in which No decision is made on June 10th, but it's just postponed. Probably with the 5%, or maybe not even with the 5%, but just the threat lingering against Mexico, and asking unachievable solutions. I mean, how can Mexico say, I am going to stop the flow of Central American migrants? We cannot do that. And I think the damage to the economy is going to be very high, not only because of the tariffs themselves, but because of the uncertainty. I mean, we have a framework that the three countries of North America have agreed together. And if you undermine that framework unilaterally, then what you bring is a lot of uncertainty, which is a real threat to the economy. And that's what I see as a lingering scenario until the U.S. elections. I mean, President Trump has learned that he gains political capital by bashing Mexico, and it's worked for him in the past, and he thinks it will work for him again. Maybe not in the midterms, but it's a different equation in the midterms. When it comes to the presidential election, I mean, the Democratic debates are going to start pretty soon. But if there's another finding from the Mueller report that comes to be known, then he will demand something else. I mean, he is insatiable. He always puts one demand after another, and a new one, and a fresh one after you've partially delivered on the prior demand. So I don't think that there is a way to please Trump. Our mistake has been to say, nobody else has been able to persuade him, but we will be able, because we have some secret magic, or great powers of persuasion that will convince Trump that he's doing the wrong thing. That does not exist. Like Beavis and Butthead used to talk, ain't gonna happen.
Well, Carlos, I'm not going to give up hope. However, that we shouldn't keep trying. Another question, please.
Thank you all. This is very informative. I'd like to pick up something that
Could you
Eric...
identify yourself, please?
Yes. I'm Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services. We work in peace building and conflict resolution. I've also worked on projects supported by USAID, although implemented by NGOs. Mm-hmm. And I want to get to, I think, your very thoughtful comments, Eric, about what can be done to address the root causes of people leaving, the lack of hope. Mark Green is a sensible man, the man who's the U.S. aid administrator, but his hands are somewhat tied. I haven't really looked at what is going on in terms of the projects supported by the missions in those three countries, but I'm wondering if more can be done there. And certainly the NGO community, which you have had experience with, is trying and has creative people, and the Peace Corps is out there somewhere. I wonder if people like you and your colleagues sitting here can't foment some action and energy. There's a lot of work done on the future of work. I can't tell you how many studies. So one issue is what kind of creative stance can be taken in terms of enabling people to address the future. It's not only agriculture. People can do other things. Why can't Guatemalans and El Salvadorians learn to code? Why can't they work in AI? Why can't the universities develop? I hope you can address some of this.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Those are great questions. I do believe that there are any number of really excellent programs that receive U.S. funding but are basically carried out either by national level NGOs or some of the implementing ones. The ones that I'm most familiar with have to do with crime prevention. which is not just setting up an after-school program. I mean, it goes much deeper than that and tries to deal with the totality of a family and the totality of the economies. And there's some very good results from that. And I'm sure in the areas you're talking about, there are good programs too. I'm less familiar with those, but I do think there's a lot that can be done and is being done. Unfortunately, the reality is, is that a decision was made at the top levels. I'm sure it wasn't Mark Green's decision to cut programs, and friends that I've known for decades in Central America are losing their jobs, being told by the embassies that half to 2/3 of their funding is disappearing. One particular group in Honduras I know well is going to have to lay off 150 people who are engaged in community-based crime prevention, are engaged in helping the Attorney General be more effective, are engaged in a whole host of things that are in the interest of the United States, one, and in the interest of building better governance and therefore more hope and trust in governance in Honduras. Those decisions have been made. This is not a theoretical situation we have with the tariffs that, well, maybe he won't, maybe he will. They have. Now, I'm told that, 17 money is gone, money from 2018 is not going to be spent. This is going to create another huge vacuum in Central America. And this is where I think Mexico could play a role, not replacing all this funding from the United States, but really saying this is something positive, concrete, we can do, and we invite the United States to support it. Not, and I think, there's sometimes a sense, as Carlos was saying, that we could come to Washington and persuade the United States to spend $10 billion in Central America when, in fact, they're cutting their programs. I don't think that's it. I think Mexico needs to say, we can show some leadership here, not at maybe those funding levels. I think there's a level that, that Mexico doesn't have those resources either, but being more strategic and being more engaged. And I think it would be to Mexico's advantage, it would be to Central America's advantage, and ultimately, I hope the U.S. will re-engage at that level as well. Not sure I answered all your questions, but...
No. Well, I think we need to move on, sorry, to another one. But thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Please, right here at the table on the left, my left side.
Thank you. Frank Lockwood, I'm with the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. So I need to ask you, if these tariffs start going on, what kind of an impact that's going to have on Walmart and farmers? But also, I just wonder if President Trump maybe his policy has backfired by creating kind of a now or never environment for people there thinking about coming to the U.S.
Yeah, they're two different questions. There are a number of good breakdowns, state-by-state breakdowns, but I think one thing that would be fair is that Walmart will feel the impact of this. It's already feeling the impact with the China tariffs. And, one area is fresh vegetables and fruits coming up from Mexico, which is a big supplier of the United States.
But if the reprisals put in place, going down also.
And then going down also. But somebody else like to add, please.
So your question was if the rhetoric coming from the president is creating this now or never situation for migrants. I think in some sense, yes, migrant networks have been shown to be quite vast. And I think with technology and WhatsApp now, for example, what is said at the U.S. border can be heard in Chiapas in a matter of seconds, right? And so their information sharing is quite remarkable. And I think, again, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that the more that policies are changed so rapidly, it does create the sense of desperation. And then also what smugglers are telling migrants feeds into that same issue, where smugglers are saying, I can, if you pay me $7,000, I'll put you on a bus and I'll get you there before the border closes. And so that type of rhetoric from smugglers and also the stop and start nature of some of these policies, I think is feeding that along with the networks of migrants themselves. Yes.
Arturo, you want to add on the?
Yeah, on the issue of tariffs, I use given that the president is in the UK, I use an expression from over there, but your way of putting it is, be careful what you wish for. The one that I use is that Oscar Wilde said that when the gods wish to punish us, they listen to our prayers. Because the impact of tariffs, whether it's just unilaterally by the United States or the combined effect of unilateral tariffs and then reciprocal countervailing duties by Mexico, is going to have a profound impact on the economies of both countries and on jobs in both countries. Maybe certainly at the beginning with 5% tariffs, the economies of both countries can more or less ride it out. But if those tariffs start reaching the 10, 15, and certainly if we reach the high point of the 25 that he has threatened to slap on Mexico, then this does become hugely, hugely dangerous, because he's been bashing Mexico for 3 years, but he still doesn't understand that in the past 20 years, Mexico and the United States have developed joint supply chains and production platforms. What that means is that out of every $1 of U.S. exports to the of Mexican exports to the United States, 40 cents, 0.40 cents of every dollar of Mexican exports are U.S. inputs, U.S. content. So those 5% tariffs, or if they were to reach 25% at the end of October, are also 5% tariffs on U.S. inputs. This would be happening at a time when red states in particular, ag states that voted for President Trump in the Electoral College, are already hurting from the tariffs. The combined tariffs of the European Union, Canada and Mexico, which were lifted 2 weeks ago, and China. That's why he's investing $15 billion in aid to farmers across the U.S. That pain would only be augmented as a result of the tariffs and then the countervailing duties applied by Mexico. So all of this happening at a time when, even though the signs of the economic signs in the U.S. are strong and resilient, but there are potential clouds on the horizon as we head into 2020, 2021. This could have a very, very important impact for the economic well-being and for international financial markets.
Thank you. Please, right here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Walter Tejada. I live in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm here in my private capacity as a Salvadoran American interested in the subject and affiliated with a number of advocacy groups for migrant rights throughout my lifetime. And I just feel that there's a need to push the envelope just a little bit more on addressing the root causes that are generating the migration that we've seen lately. The migration is not necessarily new. It's been happening at a lower number for many decades, as we all know. So it is of particularly frustration to many of us who feel that we're part of...
Ask a question, please.
Surely. As soon as I say this, so we feel ourselves that we're part of the Salvadoran diaspora. What else can be done? What is Mexico's specific role that can be done now, almost putting aside the United States, given this hyperbole political nonsense that comes out, the president's mouth, because at times the staff says something different than what he said. So what are those mechanisms, and what guidance can we give those of us who want to help? Not just the Salvadoran American diaspora, the Honduran, Guatemalan, eager and willing. In the case of El Salvador, perhaps there's a brand new opportunity with the new president and the hope there. What is the way that we can seize now and send a positive message?
Okay, so what can Mexico do to help the several Central American countries and their citizens on the move?
Okay, rather than using the verb to help, I would use to work with. I've seen so many times that you cannot just draw a plan in Washington, D.C. or in Mexico City and then tell the 3 Central Americans, this is what we thought that you should do. So the approach has to change dramatically. We have a long history, I'm talking about Mexico, a long history, especially with Guatemala, where Guatemala says, if it comes from Mexico, you got to be careful, because Mexico often has abused Guatemala, and it's funny that Trump says that Mexico abuses the United States when we learn in our history books that the United States took half of our territory, but that's another story. But to address your specific question, after the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean Plan was released on May 20th, there have been a number of roundtables to discuss implementation. And I was talking to Larry Harrington, who for many years worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, asking himself precisely these questions. And the usual approach has been, let's do a mega project. Let's do a hydroelectric plant on the Usumacinta River. And then what you generate immediately is, the quite big question by the communities who say, so that water is going to go to Monterrey, to Mexico City, and I don't even have power in my home. They came and gave us a machine to toast coffee, but there's no electricity to plug it. So I'll tell you two different things that I am trying to push to change the approach. One, instead of shoving mega projects down the throat of communities, let's be humble and change the approach and say, what do the communities need in terms of the two projects that have the biggest multiplying impact on development, on local development. In the literature, you will find the two projects that have the best and bigger multiplying impact is access to clean water and the education of young girls. I think it's quite evident in the two cases, but we can discuss that at length. And then change the approach that instead of going from the top down and the experts telling people what they need, we should be more humble and start by saying, let's make a list of the unfinished projects, the last mile of a road, a water well, a corn mill, a small health clinic, that will have an immediate impact on the quality of life of people, rather than just draw big plans that will never be completed because there will not be money and there will be resistance from the communities. So governance and the social appropriation of development plans are absolutely essential in that regard. And finally, we have a very tiny pilot project in Mexico in which we have invited students from Central America to complete their high school in Mexico, especially students who hail from communities that were threatened and in real and present danger by the maras and the pandillas. And their mothers asked the university professors and the local parish priest, can you help my son, my daughter, to complete their high school studies in a safe place? I don't mean that we're going to solve anything by just bringing kids to Mexico for them to study there, but it was a specific request by the parents, and at least it changed. It sends a change of message in the narrative. Instead of discussing just how we're going to stop the migrants, detain them, contain them, and deport them, the narrative changes in how are we going to help in the education of the most valuable, what we have that is most valuable, that is our youth.
I'm going to just add something else I think that Mexico, and frankly the United States as well, could do in terms of aiding development in Central America, and that is reforming Mexico's immigration system to include more legal opportunities for temporary and cyclical migration, as well as in the United States, because migration, if it's done in a controlled and legal manner, can actually aid development, particularly if you look at remittances from the United States to Central America. That is an important economic power in Central America. And I think that Mexico has opportunities, perhaps not in the southern states where migrants are currently contained, because that is, as we know, the poorest area of Mexico, but in other areas in the north, for example, where there are some labor market shortages, that type of cyclical temporary migration can actually help bring money back to Central American region as well. So.
Thank you. The woman sitting in the right next to the camera. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Hello, Beatriz Navarro, independent international consultant. Well, it seems that we're seeing the end of a compartmentalization, excuse my pronunciation, strategy, diplomatic strategy. One will expect that given the actions of President Trump, the tariffs will go on. Having said that, the question to both ambassadors will be, what will be the best strategy on the one hand for Mexico? If this goes, should one just move on and given the intermestic relations of both countries, let the states in the United States, the population that will get affected, put enough political pressure to the American president that it will lead to stop continuing the imposition of tariffs on the one hand? And on the other hand, my second question will be, for the Mexican government, this is definitely, it's been throwing to a leadership, to exercising a leadership in the region that probably we haven't witnessed ever before. Challenges, given what President AMLO has said that he's really not, he doesn't want to intervene to exercise this leadership, will be a good advice to help him, to advise him to keep helping the countries, Central American countries, and to exercise the leadership in the region that probably it will jeopardize at the same time his position with the states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But let me start off. I think clearly the millions of stakeholders in this relationship are key right now. And we're already seeing that in Congress with them reflecting on what they should do, both from a U.S.-Mexico point of view, but also from the broader ability to put emergency orders in place. There's a lot of questioning going on about that. And I think that it is essential that all the stakeholders in the North American trade relationship and the other parts of this relationship speak out at this time in the United States, because this is a relationship that touches really millions of people. In fact, as I often say, it's the relationship, the international relationship we have that touches the daily lives of more Americans than any other relationship. And so this will touch that. And it won't just touch them in the short run, but if we go down this path of escalating tariffs on both sides, it's going to affect public attitudes. And we're already seeing, I understand, public attitudes in Mexico. I haven't actually seen it, but I heard there's a poll today in El Financiero, which shows a very negative view of what the U.S. is doing. But I haven't seen it, so I won't give you the particular figure. I've just been told about it.
16% favorability of the United States.
16%.
16%.
And that is down significantly from what we saw in January, where there had been a real recuperation, a return to a high level of appreciation for U.S.-Mexico relations and the United States.
Yeah, it's clear that domestic constituencies in the United States need to play a very important role in pushing back against the contamination of migration with trade policy. It's the governors and it's the mayors and it's the members of Congress. In fact, several very relevant GOP senators and representatives have already questioned the president's decision to mix these two issues together, have questioned the president's use of AIPA authority to slap the tariffs on Mexico. So yes, if you're Mexico, you want to encourage and strengthen the domestic pressures coming outside the Beltway into the White House to have the president backtrack on what is I think, very unfortunate decision. On the issue of leadership, well, again, I think that the Mexican government, I think, has understood the gravity of this circumstance. That's why you've got three cabinet secretaries here in Washington as of Saturday, Sunday, preparing for meetings tomorrow. I think there is a willingness to find a solution to this and to prevent this from escalating. I think the Mexican government clearly understands the impact that this can have on the ratification of USMCA, which is, regardless of any other foreign policy positions, is clearly a priority for the López Obrador administration. So we'll see. The problem is we're all sort of here playing the role of quarterbacks without actually having seen the game start. It'll start tomorrow. We'll have a clearer sense, I guess, tomorrow, maybe Thursday, as to what the roadmap looks like and whether our guess or assessment that we may head into the waters of June 10th with the actual entry into force of these tariffs is a real scenario or not. We'll see.
Tony, there's a question over here.
I know, but I'm going back to I'm going back to the other side, and then I'll come back over here. I'll come back.
Larry Harrington, I'm on the board of the advisory board of the Wilson Center and affiliate faculty at Vanderbilt University. I just wanted to, following up on Carlos's comment, I think the president, because of the last election, I really think he's more inclined to double down because he, in fact, was able to flip. He thinks this strategy flipped Democratic seats in Florida, North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana, probably made it close in Montana, probably held on to Tennessee. So I think he thinks the strategy worked in his mind. So I think he's likely to double down. And this is a question, I'm not sure who knows the answer. I certainly don't. What happens, assuming, and I think it's more likely than not, that we get a 5% tariff next week, what physically happens at the border? I mean, aside from the 5% cost to consumers at some point, is there chaos at the border for trucks that are already in line? I mean, what sort of happens on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute level when all of a sudden a tariff is imposed? I'm just curious if we don't have, aside from the political chaos that ensues, we have sort of a real day-to-day crisis on the border, just trying to figure out what the hell is going on and to what do we attach this 5% tariff and when do we do it? Does anybody know the answer to that?
Well, there has to be guidance sent out by CBP to all the customs brokers and shippers and others. A lot of it, once that guidance goes out, a lot of it can be done electronically online because a lot of people are now filing their customs reports online. And so you can adjust and bill, presumably, but there will no doubt be some confusion because everybody won't get the news and they'll get up to the truck will drive up and, oh, you didn't file correctly. And, well, gee, I never had to before because it's duty-free. No, it's no longer duty-free. So there will be some confusion, but a lot can be done electronically. I don't know if anybody else has any other insights.
I don't. I just want to repeat what I heard on an NPR story, which is truckers and shippers are desperately trying to get through there before
Well,
Thursday.
So
it's already chaos. It's not like
right.
It's not like they're waiting to see. They're trying to get as much through as possible.
But as producers have made quite clear, they can't rush their production in a lot of these industries. They're based on using their maximum capacity on a constant basis. So there's only a bit of that rushing that can take place. There is more probably going on right now, but you can't do all of that and adjust so quickly in many of these industries. And so you have a lot of the real-time industries that are just going to have to look for that guidance and try to adapt. But they are very worried that this is going to be confusing. There will be slowdowns. That it's going to raise their costs. A lot of them have contracts that promise they're going to deliver at a certain time, and so they'll have to look to meet those deadlines. That's for sure. So we'll take this question over here, and then I'll come back here to the center.
Francisco Alvarez Garreda, energy consultant. I hope you'll permit me a question about policy rather than crisis management. Depressed or comparatively low labor wages in Mexico is a topic that often comes up in conversations around U.S.-Mexico trade. I know this came up during the 2016 primaries, and I'm just wondering if there are any maybe promising ideas that can be put out there, or even details that are in the ongoing trade deals right now that might address the lower Mexican wages or allow the U.S. to negotiate some kind of commensurate mechanism.
Well, in the new USMCA, there's, of course, the whole labor chapter has been put into that agreement, where it was a side letter before. So the commitment to respect labor rights would be part of this treaty if we get it approved. Secondly, Mexico has just approved major labor reforms, which on their own are now have put these into the Constitution and into Mexican law. Implementation is going to be over a 4-year period because Mexico is under its own law committed to establish a number of new instances, let me call them, where people can bring disputes. They can be solved. There's going to have to be elections at all Mexican businesses across the country, which is a big undertaking in itself, and people will have the right to choose their representatives. And there will be competition among organizations that don't exist yet that will emerge. So it will be a difficult process, but what you will see out of this is, in fact, Mexican wages, I believe, will start to go up. They'll be affected by this because workers will have new rights in places they didn't have rights before. I don't know, Arturo, Carlos?
Yeah, on this specific issue, something that shocked many people in the presentation by the United Nations of the development plan is that there was a graph in which they showed the level of minimum wages in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And guess which country has the lowest minimum wage?
Yeah.
And early on in this administration, the president said, we're going to let Central American workers toil in the big infrastructure construction projects in southeastern Mexico, namely the Tren Maya, the Corredor Transísmico, the Sembrando Vida, planting trees. And guess what? We already hear that they're not interested because Mexico pays so low wages, and say the whole idea of going to the United States is saving some money to send back home. If you work in Mexico, then we won't be able to save some money. I mean, I know there is, and Rachel made the point, that there's an increasing number of people that are taking Mexico as their destination. But many of those, it may be the case, in many of those cases, it may just happen that they have been deported already. They have tried once, twice, 3 times, didn't make it, and say, well, I'm not going back to Honduras, so I may just decide to stay in Mexico, but not because it is their best option. But there's another ongoing debate after the new labor law was passed, and it is the fact that for decades, Mexico bet on low wages to be competitive in international trade. And there's an outcry that, if Mexico wants to be competitive and enhance productivity, it shouldn't do it through low wages. I mean, Germany, Japan are huge exporters, and the manufacturing wages in Germany and Japan, of course, it's a completely different scenario, but I just named this because I also see the end of an era in which Mexico bet on being competitive exclusively through low wages.
Let me just add 2 points on that question. One, the U.S. International Trade Commission, when it was doing a study of the impact of USMCA, said they estimated there'd be an average increase of 17.2% in Mexican wages over 5 years or so. So they anticipate these reforms will in fact have an impact. And secondly, on which workers from Central America might stay in Mexico, it really depends where they're coming from. If they're coming from the highlands of Guatemala because their coffee plants are all destroyed by disease, they're more open.
Or by climate change.
Or by climate change, or the combination of the two. Their view of work is different than somebody coming from a manufacturing job in one of those countries. Right here, please.
Thank you. Jake Patrick Collins, in between jobs right now, so I'm here in my personal capacity today. But I do want to touch on a topic that hasn't been touched on yet, really today. Under the president's national security strategy that was released here early in his administration, the U.S. is putting more emphasis on great power competition, so i.e., how can we rein in Chinese and Russian influence, among others, throughout the world. And so should these tariffs go into effect, how strong is the argument that Mexico and President Lopez Obrador will accelerate its trade and commerce engagement with China? And if that argument is strong, isn't this tariff measure directly in contrary to the president's national security strategy and putting the Mexicans in the laps of the Chinese? If you can just touch on that, that'd be great.
Arturo, why don't you take the first crack at that one?
The poll that was published today by newspaper El Financiero in Mexico City has I tweeted this morning, has an interesting question, which is, it was, by the way, it was conducted Saturday and Sunday, so a day after Trump announced the threat to impose tariffs on Mexico, and it was published today. The question of, as a result of the tariffs, should Mexico continue to favor its trading relationship with the United States or seek other more favorable trading relationship? 57% are in favor of dumping the trade relationship with the United States and seeking a free trade agreement with China. So yes, there is a potential boomerang effect in the sense of that Mexico is a bit of a unique country in Latin America because, contrary to some of our neighbors in the southern part of the hemisphere, we're not a commodity exporting country. So the footprint that you've seen China develop in places like Brazil and Argentina and Peru, and where commodities are a very important piece of the equation, we don't have that in Mexico. But certainly I think Mexico would be willing to start looking at China as a trading partner, and given that Mexico did stay within the TPP and Mexican exports towards the Asia-Pacific region will be benefited in the medium-long term as a result of the TPP, you could see some important movement towards the deepening of economic and trade ties between China and the United States. I always have argued that the best way for the United States to take on some of the geo-economic and eventually geopolitical challenges that China does represent for the interests of the United States is to deepen the North American architecture, and the modernization and revamping of NAFTA is piece and parcel to that equation. So yes, at the end of the day, all of this could lead to the question being made in Washington, D.C. in less than a decade by policymakers as to who lost Mexico.
Please.
Alexis from Bloomberg Law. So you've touched on the question I'm going to ask a little bit, but just want to ask a more focused question about the USMCA. How much have these threatened tariffs jeopardized the potential path to ratification? And also, as we're looking to the meeting that's supposed to take place tomorrow at the White House with Mexican officials, what's the outlook for a positive resolution? And what needs to take place for that to happen?
Two different questions.
Yeah, so let me start off on USMCA. So before attention was diverted to possible tariffs being put in place, there was an opening with momentum to try to resolve the outstanding differences between the House of Representatives in particular and the Democrats there and the administration on USMCA. And that meant exploring options for their concerns, which were around labor and labor enforcement, and a little bit the environment and a little bit biologics and protections for those. That was still going to be difficult work to bridge those differences and to find a way forward. That dialogue is now not taking place because the focus has now been shifted. So how long-term that is, we'll have to see, but a number of senators and congressmen and businesses and others have said they are worried this can derail the discussions for a very small window to get progress over the weeks ahead, and we only have a little time really before our political window in the United States closes to try and get this vote done, and people will just be focused on the presidential election next year. And then, as Arturo mentioned, the Canadians have elections this fall, so their Parliament is going to stand up, I think it's called, i.e. go out of session in June, and after that, they won't be able to act on it either. So there are just these small windows to make progress, and we're now not focused on that progress.
Yeah, sort of the road to USMCA ratification was already challenging without what we saw on Friday. And by the way, remember, on Friday we got a double whammy because a couple of hours before the threat on tariffs to Mexico was made public by the president, he decided to submit notification of USMCA to Congress when the agreement with Speaker Pelosi had been to wait and do it of common accord when she had finished her consultations with her party. She had designated the lead members of Congress who were going to engage with the White House on these 4 or 5 outstanding issues that they want to address in the teeing up to the ratification process and in the ratification process itself. So on Friday, you had a 1-2 punch, one which was directly related and has a direct impact on USMCA, which was the decision to submit this, and that's why Speaker Pelosi, I think she was in San Francisco, immediately responded that this had violated what they had agreed to do. And then a couple of hours later, you had this one. I find it very hard. I'm not the Mexican government. You're going to have to ask them. But I would find it very hard for the Mexican government to not press pause in the congressional ratification process of USMCA in the Mexican Senate if the tariffs get slapped on June 10th. So what all of this is building up to, regardless of what direct impact tariffs and migration have on the USMCA debate, is that an already tight calendar is being compressed. Let's assume that nothing goes awry and the Dems say, okay, you sent the notification, send it to us in 30 days. Remember, it's 30 congressional days in which both chambers of Congress are in session. So if you do the math, the earliest possible, if nothing were to happen, that the administration could be submitting USMCA to Congress is July 9th. And then you've got the congressional days under TPA authority, which both the Senate and the House, congressional days have to debate and then eventually vote yay or nay on USMCA. So if you start thinking of already your June challenge with the Canadians, plus the clock ticking here with presidential elections, and a fundamental question that the Dems have to make, which is, are they going to give President Trump a victory to crow on before 2020?
What was your other question?
Oh, it was about what happens on Wednesday, or?
Yeah. Wow.
For those of us who've been, for two of us who are now recovering diplomats and recovering ambassadors, and have been doing this for all of our adult and non-adult lives. It's very hard that we're going to get white smoke tomorrow. I think what we will see tomorrow is both delegations will identify the contours of what the conversation is going to be about. And based on what the items of the conversations look like, then you're going to start having the serious discussion of what can you do, what you can't do, what is acceptable and what isn't. So I may be wrong. I may be absolutely, surprised, and we have white smoke tomorrow, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to, again, I think also that regardless of what's happening in the rooms at the State Department, my sense is that this president wants to be able to prove that he's slapped on the tariffs, even if it's for 48 hours, and say that, he's done what he promised to do, and to have the negotiations ongoing with the tariffs on. So because of those two things, I don't think you're going to see too much clarity in the next 5-6 days. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to end up where we all hope they will end, but I don't think you're going to see an immediate sense of resolution in the coming days.
So to take another angle, saying the same thing but a different way, it is quite possible that the officials sitting together on Wednesday afternoon can agree to an outline of actions and a calendar that could address U.S. concerns and actually address the problem. That would take a while to spell out, but it could be a process. The possibility of doing that, from having been involved in similar situations, is different from, as Arturo was talking about, the likelihood that it will really happen. But you could make a lot of progress on a framework tomorrow, and even a calendar that could then be followed up on to make that more solid and have more detailed agreement. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you all very much for being with us.